This is Theology Bits, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. I'm Pastor Ben. This video continues our series, The World of the New Testament. The last video was an overview, and this video will focus on one aspect of what was in that overview in more depth, Roman religion. And a reminder that this video series is not just the culture of what was around the New Testament, but what aspects of the culture help us read the New Testament differently. And one thing that's very important for us to understand is the religious marketplace that the early Jesus followers were living in. Meaning, this new form of religiosity showed up, especially when this came to Gentiles rather than only to Jews, and it showed up in the midst of already very many different kinds of religiosity. And so it's important for us to be able to understand, what is it that's happening in this time period? What kind of religiosity is present? And where would this Jesus movement fit? This video is only going to mention the Jesus movement a little bit. It's mostly going to be just what's the setting? What were they expecting at this time period? Because there's a lot of things I think we understand or vaguely understand about the religious marketplace, and then there's things that we might not when we're talking about Roman religion. Well, one thing I want to say really quickly, because some people will really conflate Roman religion with Greek religion. And the reason I bring that up is because many of you will know about Greek mythology. Well, we have almost no Roman mythology. We have a little bit, but these stories about the history of the gods and so on, there's a lot of those in Greek religion. Roman religion, we just don't have any. That doesn't mean they didn't have mythology, it just means it wasn't preserved. And it might be, in fact, that the mythology they had was just copied from the Greeks, but we have to be cautious, we don't know. The other thing to point out is that the stories about the history of the gods are not the religious behavior. What we are interested in is the religious behavior of regular people in the Roman Empire. And that wasn't, even in Greece, it wasn't recite these narratives. It was instead worship life. But to understand it, I'm going to start with what it's not. And the reason I want to start with what it's not is because most of the things that we think about as religiosity, especially in an American context, many of them do not translate from Roman religion. We know a few big differences, the biggest one being polytheism. We'll talk more about polytheism in a moment. But here, what is the distinction of this kind of mythology rather than others, this kind of religiosity rather than others? So it's important to know, what is Roman religion not? Well, the one thing it is not is creedal. No, there was very few aspects of Roman religiosity that was asking for some recitation of what I believe. It simply was not part of it. Faith was not really part of it, or doctrine was not really part of it. Books, religious books that were held to be holy in some way, really was not a thing. More specifically, with the exclusivity was not an expectation, that you would exclusively worship one God rather than another. Ethics were not part of religion. Of course, they cared about ethics, but it just wasn't part of religion. That was philosophy. Afterlife was not part of their religious life. This was about this world. So you see, these are some of the most foundational aspects of Christianity, and here they don't have any of them. They think of religion simply differently. And religiosity is primarily concerned with the present world, not an afterlife, but instead, how do we live right now. What's more, religiosity is going to be focused far less on any kind of statements of faith or books that I hold and form in who I am in my life. That's more ethics, but instead is going to be formal worship. And you did formal worship in temples. And in the temples, one would go to the priests, and the priests would provide offerings and sacrifices. This, by the way, similar to what the priests did in the temple in Jerusalem, but very different in that the way in which they worshiped was about temple worship, and it didn't have to do with who you were. It had to do with what you brought forward. And then there was a relationship of what we call a do ut des relationship, which means I act with the result that you would act. I, the worshiper, act, I make an offering or a sacrifice with the result that you, the God, would act and do something. And you, the God, would act with the result that I, the human, would come back and offer another sacrifice. There was very much a backward and forward relationship between gods and humans. They did not have a view of radical dependence that humans had on gods. And this has to do with polytheism. One big difference between polytheism and monotheism is when you have monotheism and you have one God and only one God, then you are in this area of radical discontinuity between the gods versus between the gods and the humans. Whereas here, there was far more continuity rather than difference between humans and God. And that might be surprising because, frankly, it did depend on the God. There were some gods that were it's almost a triangle, a pyramid here. Some gods that were way above where humans were. You know, if you put humans down here, and depending on, we'll just call it the one here, notable from philosophy. And there was a kind of hierarchy among the gods that you get down to these ones here where you're kind of with demigods, heroes, people like Heracles, kind of half gods, that now what makes the human different from the gods is not so clear cut. Instead, there's a lot more continuity. And so there was this idea that, and even some humans, extraordinary humans, usually emperors, could in fact be seen as demigods and be deified. And so you definitely had a different structure of how we understood reality around us. And of course, it was a world here rather than exclusivity, but as of openness. When the Roman Empire would come and conquer a new space, they would discover that the area, they had different gods than they did. No problem. We have many gods, and we will just add your gods to our pantheon. All the gods, and just say, absolutely, we welcome all religious behavior. What they couldn't understand was a kind of monotheism that didn't accept their own gods too. But that's more one of the challenges Christianity has, where it just didn't translate. But it's also a bigger issue because they thought of there's so many gods and so many people, and they thought of gods in terms of function. A god did a thing. A god or goddess did a thing. And so, if I wanted something done, I'd go to that god's temple, I'd make an offering to that god, and then that god would act in that way on my behalf. If it was a different function, different god. And so, this is the way they thought of gods. Very different from the way I think we think of gods. But there are some practical implications of this as well, because not only did they think of gods in terms of function, but also there was a societal component to religiosity in this time period. That is, religious rituals were, unless you were very wealthy, the only time the community would eat meat. Because you see, these sacrifices were not whole burnt offerings, meaning you'd put the whole animal on the altar and burn it all up. Instead, you would take a small portion of the animal, usually the leg bones, and you would wrap them in fat, and sometimes some of the inner organs, put those on the altar and burn those, and then the rest of the animal would be butchered, and it would be distributed to the community there. And that was the way in which the priests were doing the sacrifice, but how did most people participate was by eating the rest of the food that was present. So sacrifices were as much worship to the gods as they were a communal experience of a common meal that we would all come together and have a banquet. And that was often the only time people would eat meat, was because meat was very expensive and that's almost all they could offer. There were, by the way, offerings that were not meat, that were other things. In fact, wine was very frequent, and there were, in fact, it's called chthonic deities, that is, deities below rather than only above, and you'd often pour the wine onto the ground, and it would go into the ground, and that's how those deities would be able to participate. But this is how critical it was. It was a community meal. And the meat that they'd have would then be to eat it is to participate. Some of you know 1 Corinthians and start to understand a little bit of why meat was such a big deal. It also was how they structured even the calendar. How they knew where they were through religious festivals. They didn't have a calendar with the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th. They'd have so many days after the first of the month, religious festival. So many days before or after the Ides, the 15th of the month, religious festival. And then other festivals that would be within the structure of it. So even to know when we are and to be able to talk about it, you're talking in terms of religious festivals. But it's also important to understand something else. While they are communal meals, they are not a single community. And what I mean by that was this has to do with the lack of exclusivity. That is, when there's an exclusive religiosity, then you expect the community to be a relatively stable thing. The people who come are the people who come to this temple and they continue to come, and like you have in synagogue or in Christian worship, where you have a community that holds together and supports one another. Well, here, while they did things in common, they didn't have that sense of community in religion. They did in other things. What they had was a bunch of people come together, but there's no expectation that the same group is going to come together again. Instead, it is, yes, absolutely not individual, but it was relatively, open in that sense, without that same sort of commitment. There also, I've been talking about temples, was room for religiosity in the home, like the household god called the penates, which were gods of the household that you would worship in the household, or the lares, which were ancestors. And both of these gods, kind of lower gods in this structure, ancestors are humans who have died, but they would protect the home. They didn't have much force beyond the home seemingly, but in the home they would. So in the home, everywhere there is religiosity happening. I want to mention one thing, which is there was also a fringe group that we call the mystery religions. These religions are more like these things here than we would expect. These were things such as the cult of Mithras, or Isis, or Orpheus. These mystery religions did talk about afterlife. They did care about ethics, and they often did have books. Sometimes they asked for consistency and community, and not just anybody could join them. They were exclusionary for that reason. We want this community to mean something, so therefore you have to really do something to enter into it. We'll possibly talk more about mystery religions at another time, but those are more alike. But they also need to be understood as incredibly small. Most people's religiosity was more like this. So when we're reading, especially the letters of Paul, when he's working with Gentiles, this is what they're used to. So when they are going and adopting this new religiosity, they are often completely confused as to what in the world Paul's talking about, because it's just difficult to translate. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.